3 generations of women sold from her family. A Lakota chief ended the line at his fire. The fire had burned low by the time I heard the dogs. Not barking. That I would have understood. What they were doing was different, a low, uncertain sound at the edge of camp, the sound a dog makes when it doesn't know whether to run or hold ground. I set down the horn spoon I'd been turning in my hands and listened. Wind from the northwest, late in the season for a wind that cold. I pulled my robe around my shoulders and stepped outside. The stars were hard and closed the way they get in that first deep cold before the heavy snows come. My breath showed white. The dogs were at the south edge of camp, both of them, pressing low to the ground but not retreating, their attention fixed on something between 2 stands of cottonwood. I didn't call out. I walked toward them, and whatever was in the trees heard me coming. She came out with her hands where I could see them. That's the first thing I remember, the deliberateness of it. No stumbling, no panic. Just a woman who had learned to show her hands first and ask questions after, because that was how you stayed alive when you had no one watching for you. She was maybe 25. She wore a dress that had been good once, Lakota cut with quillwork along the yoke, but the quillwork was broken in places and the hem was torn. She had a blanket twisted around her upper body. Her moccasins were wrong for the weather, thin-soled summer work, and she had wrapped strips of rabbit hide around them. She'd done that herself, out in the dark somewhere, alone. You could see the knots were a woman's knots, the kind you tie when your hands are cold and you don't have time to be careful, but you're careful anyway. I said nothing for a moment. She said nothing. The dogs had settled into watching. She told me her name was Chumani. Raindrops. She said it the way a person states a fact they are tired of having ignored, not waiting for me to decide if I'd use it, just putting it down between us like a stone. I told her my name. She already knew it. That surprised me some. I brought her to the fire. My name is Lakota. My father's name before me was Lakota also, which caused some confusion when we were in the same camp, and my grandfather had simply been called by a name that meant something to do with the way a hawk circles before it stoops, a name that took a long time to say and was beautiful to hear. But he'd been gone since I was 9, and now only the oldest women in camp could say it correctly. I had been chief of this band for 11 years. We were not large, 31 people that autumn, including 8 children, and we moved with the seasons the way my grandfather had, though the distances had grown shorter over the years and the places we could go had grown fewer. The pressure from every direction had been building my entire life, and I had learned to think of it as weather, a thing you didn't control, only prepared for. I had never sold a woman. I say that not as a boast but as a plain thing, the way you'd say I have never broken my word to a man who kept his. There are men who trade in women. They do it in different ways with different words, but it is the same transaction regardless of the words. My grandfather had done it once in a desperate season, and he'd spoken of it to my father with something in his voice I was old enough to recognize even then. Shame lives in a man's chest differently than grief. Grief softens eventually. Shame calcifies. I had watched it harden in him the last years of his life. So I knew what it was when it arrived at my fire. Chumani did not tell me everything that first night. She told me what she needed to tell me to stay, that she had left a camp 2 days to the southeast, that there were men who would come looking, and that she had no one left. That last part she said without inflection, the way you report weather. I fed her. I had my youngest sister, Winona, make a place for Chumani in the women's lodge. I told Winona nothing except that this woman was a guest and would be treated as such. Winona was 17 and wise enough not to ask questions in front of a stranger. I went back to my fire and sat until the coals were gray. The men who would come looking. She had said it as a fact, not a fear. That was the part that stayed with me. Fear would have been easier. You could reassure a frightened woman. What she had was something older and flatter than fear. It was the calm of a person who has been found before. In the morning she was still there. I don't know what I had half expected. I found her at the edge of camp before the sun was properly up, crouched by the water, washing her face and the back of her neck with the focused economy of someone who has learned to do what needs doing without making a performance of it. She heard me coming and turned, and the way she turned, ready, balanced, not startled but positioned, told me something. I sat down on a rock nearby. She finished what she was doing and turned to face me. I asked her to tell me the rest. She told me. It took a long time. She had a way of speaking that circled back to make sure I understood the shape of a thing before she moved forward, and I came to understand that she'd learned this because people had misunderstood her before, and she had paid for those misunderstandings. She told the story the way you teach a difficult skill, carefully, in the right order, watching for comprehension. Her grandmother had been traded to a man from another band when she was 15, for 3 horses and a promise of alliance that the other band never honored. Her grandmother had told her this. Had told it to her daughter also, Chumani's mother, as a kind of warning or perhaps just as the truth. This is what happened to me. This is what our family is to certain men. A thing to be exchanged. Her mother had been sold at 17. Not traded, sold for money to a man who worked the camps around the trading post, performing services that Chumani described plainly and I understood without requiring more words. Her mother had lived with that man for 4 years, had 2 children by him, one of whom survived, Chumani. The man her mother had been sold to died in a fight over a horse. Chumani's mother had returned to her own people, but the uncle who'd sold her was still living. And when Chumani turned 16, that uncle began to discuss terms with a man named Pizzi Gall, though this was not the famous one, just a man who'd taken the name because he admired it, who ran a small camp, and was known to have an arrangement with a hide trader who operated a post 3 days east. Her mother died of a chest sickness before anything was settled. The uncle proceeded without her. She had been at Pizzi's camp for 7 years. She was not the only woman there on those terms. She told me there were 4 others. She told me this with her eyes steady on mine, because she wanted me to understand that she was not asking me to forget anything, not asking me to pretend she was something she wasn't. She was asking me to hear the whole of it and decide. I heard the whole of it. Then I asked her one question. I asked her if she had left of her own decision or if someone had helped her leave. She said, "My own decision, my own feet, my own knots on my own moccasins." I said, "Then you arrived here on your own terms." She looked at me for a long moment. Something in her face shifted, not softened exactly, but adjusted, the way a person's face changes when they hear a thing said that they had not known they needed to hear. I said, "You will stay here under my protection. You will not be exchanged, sold, traded, or transferred by any arrangement I make or any arrangement made in my name. If Pizzi comes, I will speak with Pizzi." She said, "What if speaking with Pizzi is not enough?" I said, "Then I will find another way to communicate with Pizzi." She looked at her hands, then she looked back at me. She said, "I don't want you to fight for me." I said, "I wasn't asking your permission." That came out harder than I intended, but she didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly, the way a person does when they are reassessing something, and then she said, "All right." We walked back to camp. Pizzi came 11 days later. I had expected him sooner. The delay told me something, that he'd spent time trying to find out who I was before he came, which meant he was not entirely foolish, but that he'd come anyway, which meant he'd decided he could handle it. Men like Pizzi make that calculation often. They are right about it often enough that they keep making it. He came with 2 men. That was a considered number, enough to show he was serious, not enough to look like a war party. He was a compact, careful-moving man with a scar from his left ear down to his jaw, and he sat his horse well. I'll give him that. He had a trader's face, pleasant surface over a mind constantly running numbers. I let him dismount. I had coffee ready, which is a particular kind of message. It says, "I am not afraid of you and I am willing to spend time on this, and the time I spend on it will cost me nothing." We sat, we drank. His 2 men stood back. My men were visible around the camp going about their business, which was also a message. Pizzy told me that Chumani had left his camp without permission, that she had obligations to him which were still outstanding, and that he had come to discuss her return or an appropriate settlement. I let him finish. There is power in letting a man say his whole piece before you say anything. Then I said, "She arrived at my fire and I took her in. She is under my protection. She won't be returning to you, and there will be no settlement because there is nothing owed." He said she was there under an agreement. I said, "What agreement? Whose name was on it? Who in her family made that agreement? Describe the terms." He couldn't, not cleanly. The actual arrangement, when you pressed it, was a series of understandings. Her uncle's expectations, his own expectations, a verbal accounting of a debt that was never quite defined. That's how these things work. They're built to be clear when they serve the man holding them and murky when they need to be examined. I told him that. I told him it plainly, without heat, the way you'd explain to a man that his arithmetic was wrong. I said, "You are describing an obligation that was imposed on a woman by men who had no right to impose it. You have no claim on Chumani. You have no claim in this camp. I am telling you this respectfully, and I am asking you to go." His face went through several things. The pleasant surface cracked once, just briefly, and I saw something underneath it that was genuinely dangerous, and then it settled again. He said, "You're making an enemy today." I said, "I have enough enemies that one more won't change my habits any." He looked around the camp. He looked at my men. He was running his numbers. Then he stood, and his 2 men moved to their horses, and Pizzy stood there one more moment with his hand near his belt, and I stayed seated and waited and didn't reach for anything because reaching for something would have meant I thought he had the ability to put me in danger. He didn't. Not today. He would know that from how I was sitting. He left. I won't pretend it was finished. Men like Pizzy don't leave clean. They circle. They look for a different angle. About 3 weeks later, I heard from a trader. I trusted that Pizzy had been asking around about my band's winter range, who I traded with, whether I'd had trouble with any of the agencies. The kind of questions a man asks when he is building a picture before he comes at something from the side. So I made some moves of my own. There is a man, I won't use his name, but he is someone who has found it useful to have my goodwill over the years, who had some standing with the agency to our north. I sent him a message, and I called in the goodwill. What I asked for wasn't much. I asked for it to be known in the right places that Chumani was in my camp under my protection, and that any arrangement previously claimed over her was not recognized. These things matter. The written word matters differently than the spoken word, and I had learned long before this when each was the right tool. Pizzy made one more approach, through a 3rd man, and I sent the 3rd man back with a message that I had already described the situation to the relevant authorities, and that any further contact would be interpreted as a threat to my people, and documented accordingly. That was the last I heard of Pizzy. By then it was full winter. Chumani had settled into the life of the camp. She was a skilled woman, her hands knew things, the specific knowledge built over years of work. She tanned well. She sewed well. She knew plants I didn't know, and she showed Winona some of them. The 2 of them going through the dried stores together in the evenings. Chumani naming and explaining in a quiet voice, while Winona listened with the concentrated attention of a young woman who understands that practical knowledge is worth having. She was careful with people. She watched before she spoke, and she spoke precisely when she did. The older women in camp had accepted her within the first week. Women generally know things about other women that take men longer to figure out. I heard from Winona, who heard from one of the older women, that they had said Chumani had the bearing of someone who had survived. Not thrived, yet survived, which was its own kind of respect. I watched her from a distance. I don't mean that in a covert way. I mean I was chief, and she was a new person in my camp, and watching over people in my camp was my function. But I'd be lying if I said there wasn't more to it than that. There was a quality to her that I kept coming back to. It was something about the way she worked. She didn't work to be noticed, and she didn't work to disappear. She just worked steadily, without complaint, without performance. In a camp where everyone's contributions were visible to everyone else, it was a particular kind of self-possession to do your share and no more and no less, and not spend any of yourself on what people thought about it. I had not been with a woman since my wife died. That had been 4 years. I was 43 years old, and I had built a wall around that part of myself that I was aware was not entirely rational, but that had served its purpose in a season when I had needed to be fully the chief and fully nothing else. You make those choices. You pay those costs. You don't always know when you've paid enough. It was deep winter, maybe 6 weeks after Chumani had arrived, when the boy Chaitan got lost. He was 9, son of my cousin Kohana, and he had the boy's version of his father's confidence, just enough that it outran his actual skill. He'd gone out after a rabbit and walked into a change in the weather that had moved faster than anyone expected, and by the time the snow was coming in hard and sideways, we were still short one boy in camp. I went out with Kohana and 2 other men. The wind was bad. You could lose a person 200 yards from camp in that kind of white blindness. We found Chaitan 2 hours later by following the creek upstream, which is where I had guessed he'd go because he was a boy from this camp who'd walked this land his whole life, and when you're lost and scared in this land you go to water if you can find it. He was in bad shape, tucked under a cutbank, mostly sheltered, not panicking, doing the right things, sitting still, keeping his hands inside his robe, but his feet were wrong and he couldn't feel 2 of his toes. We got him back to camp. I carried him the last part on my back, both of us half blind in the snow, and I have to tell you that carrying a frightened, suffering child through bad weather in the dark is one of the things that reminds you what you're for. Chumani met us at the edge of camp. I don't know how she knew we were close, heard something maybe, or she'd been watching, but she was there with a blanket and she was the first one to Chaitan, her hands already moving, unwrapping the robe to check him, talking to him in a low, steady voice. She didn't look at me for instruction, and she didn't need to. She worked on his feet for 2 hours. She had Winona boiling water at different temperatures. She had a poultice she made from things in her stores. She kept the boy calm by simply being calm herself, not performing calm, actually being it, which children can tell the difference. He kept both toes. That's the kind of thing that shifts something in a camp. Not just gratitude, though that was real. It was the visible proof of what a person was made of, which people in a small band understand the value of at a level that is almost cellular. After that night, there were no more questions about Chumani's standing. She was not just a guest or a taken-in woman or someone waiting to be sorted. She was one of us. I asked her to walk with me the next afternoon, when the storm had blown through and left that particular blue-white stillness behind. We went along the creek. The ice had thickened and the cottonwoods were bare against the sky, and the snow lay unbroken except for the lines of animal tracks that crossed it like writing. She walked the way she did everything, purposefully, without wasted motion. I didn't have a speech prepared. I am not a man who prepares speeches for personal things. I said what was true. I told her that I had watched her since she arrived and that I respected what I saw. I told her that the camp had become a better place with her in it. I told her that I was 43 years old and that I had been a widower for 4 years, and that I had not thought there would be another woman, but that I would be lying to myself if I pretended I didn't want her to stay. Not stay as a woman under protection, stay as my wife. I told her I wasn't asking her to decide anything today. I told her that whatever she decided, her standing in this camp would not change. I wasn't offering her a trade. I wasn't offering her safety in exchange for herself. I was telling her where I stood. She walked for a while without speaking. The snow squeaked under our moccasins. A raven went over, its wings loud in the still air. She said, "When I left Pizzy's camp, I left at night. I walked for 2 days. I had no food after the first half day. When your dogs found me, I was so tired I had stopped being afraid, which is a kind of tired I had been before and knew how to manage. And when you brought me to the fire and I saw your face, I didn't see pity. I didn't see a man calculating what I was worth. I saw a man asking himself what was right." She stopped walking. She turned and looked at me directly. Her eyes in that winter light were very dark and very steady. She said, "I thought about leaving after Pizzy came and went. I thought, now the debt is paid, I can go. But I didn't go. I kept finding reasons not to go, and eventually I understood that the reason I was staying was not reasons. The reason I was staying was you." I said, "Then stay." She said, "I intend to." She put her hand on my forearm, her fingers wrapped around it, and it was a plain thing, a deliberate thing, not a gesture of gratitude or dependence, but of choosing. Her grip was firm. She held on for a moment, and then we turned and walked back toward camp together. We were married in the early spring. It was not a large ceremony. The camp was not large, but the women had made it beautiful. Chumani wore her grandmother's dress, which she had kept rolled in the bottom of the pack she'd carried out of Pizzy's camp on the night she left. She had carried that dress 2 days through the cold. When I understood what she had brought with her, what she had chosen to carry, I understood something about the shape of her that I couldn't have gotten from anything she said. Her grandmother's dress, that's what she'd saved. We stood together in the early morning light, and the old woman who performed the ceremony had a voice that carried far in the still air, and the children were quiet, which was unusual. Even the dogs sat down. Afterward, when people had drifted back to their fires and the morning had given way to ordinary work, Chumani and I stood together for a moment alone. She was still wearing the dress. There was a smell of sweetgrass on the air from the ceremony. I said, "Your grandmother would have been glad of this." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, I think she would have." She leaned into my side and I put my arm around her and we stood there together, not speaking, looking out over the camp, waking up to the day. The creek was running free now, the ice gone, and the cottonwoods were starting to show green. The children were coming out of the lodges. Chayton ran past us chasing a dog and didn't even look up. This is what it was. This is what I had held the wall to make room for. 3 generations of women sold or traded or handed off by men who had measured them in horses and alliances and debts that were never real. 3 generations of women whose own choices had been treated like an obstacle to be managed rather than a thing to be honored. It ended here, at my fire on my terms. Not because I was better than other men or because I had made myself a story about being better, but because I had looked at Chumani in the dark at the edge of camp on a cold night and understood what she'd already survived to get there, and understood that the only thing a man with any standing at all could do with that kind of arrival, those kinds of knots on a woman's moccasins, was be worth her having walked toward. I hoped I had been. She was still leaning into my side. Her grandmother's dress, sweetgrass on the air, Chayton running, the creek going. I was 43 years old and it was spring. I had never been so certain I was in the right place in my life.